Greetings, everyone. I'm so happy to see you. Thank you very, very much for joining me once again. Welcome from stormy Washington. It's a very lively night here in our nation's capital. I think Vincent Price would be very pleased with the atmosphere. And if you think Vincent Price would be pleased with the atmosphere of thunder and lightning, very, very frightening, please raise your hand. And that way I'll know whether or not you can hear me. Yay, okay, well, thank you very much. You can all put your hands down. Amy, Jess, Mary, Richard, Sue, Susan, and Thea, thank you so much for being here. I'm always very honored that you choose to spend this time with me discussing the Bhagavad Gita. I hope you've all had a very nice week thus far. I've had an interesting and somewhat confusing week thus far, confused by technology. I'm easily confused in general, and life is confusing. And technology doesn't always make my life easier. I remember as a kid, my parents took me to the World's Fair in New York, and we were introduced to all of this technology of the future. It's going to look like the Jetsons. And all this technology is going to save us a lot of time and make our lives very easy. And I don't know about you, but not for me. There are, of course, wonderful things that I can do with technology. For example, I can speak with you. And you can participate in this webinar, and that's great. But it hasn't saved me any time, and it hasn't made me any less confused about the world or technology. If you find the world to be confusing, you're in very good company, because Arjuna also is confused about what Krishna has told him, and therefore he has not yet figured out what's going on and what he should do about what's going on. So if you arrived at this point in the Bhagavad Gita and you feel like you haven't completely understood it, don't worry, neither has Arjuna. So we're in good company. All right, on with the show. Two choices here, interesting. So this is webinar number 14, and today is May 31st, just in case you were wondering what today is, now you know. You already know that you can raise your hand if you are new to our satsang, and I see some other folks are joining us as even as we speak, or at least as I speak. I know you're all listening attentively, and therefore you're not speaking. You can adjust your audio settings if you want to hear me more better, up in the upper right-hand corner. Don't worry about your microphone or video camera. I cannot see or hear you. You can see and hear me. It's a one-way street in that regard. But I can see you in our panelist group, and I can also see your questions. So if you have a question or a comment at any point in time during the proceedings, please just go ahead and type that question or comment into the Q&A window. And I will keep an eye out for your question or comment and respond to it as quickly as I possibly can. Last week, we concluded our discussion of the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita. We spoke about how the life of an introspective sage and the life of someone who is engaged in the pursuit of material desires is like the difference between night and day. And an afterthought to that, modern yoga how is modern yoga like the introspective pursuit of a sage who is interested in spiritual life? How much is modern yoga just like the pursuit of material desires? Give that some thought, and if you have some comments, put it on the Facebook discussion page. I will remind us all about that a little bit later. But if you're new, we have a Gita Satsang Facebook page. And I would love to know your thoughts about how well modern yoga is doing in your eyes relative to what the Bhagavad Gita is teaching us so far about the distinction between spiritual life, which we pursue through the practice of yoga, and material life, which is, so far, we hear antithetical to yoga. We spoke a little about the practice of contentment and reviewed the entire chapter. We're going to reflect back on some aspects of chapter 2 again this evening as we discuss the fact that Arjuna doesn't get it. What doesn't he get? Why doesn't he get it? We're going to talk about that this evening. We're going to talk a little bit more about action versus renunciation, because that's what Arjuna is having a hard time wrapping his head around. How these two things go together as opposed to how they are two different things. We're going to talk about how to be a yoga poser, which is something of concern for all of us in so many different ways. The verses we'll cover this evening are verses, chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. Okay, so as has been our usual habit, I'm going to read through the English translation of the verses. Then I'm going to circle back and go into each verse in some detail. So here we go. This is chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Arjuna said, "O Janardana, Krishna, if discernment and reason are higher than fruitive work, then why do you want me to engage in this horrific warfare? O Keshava, I'm confused by your bewildering instructions. Therefore, please tell me definitively what singular course of action I should take in order to achieve the greater good." Verse 3, Krishna replies, the beloved Lord said, "O sinless Arjuna, I have described the steady path through this world as twofold. For contemplatives, it is the yoga of knowledge, and for those who are active, it is the yoga of action." Verses 4 and 5. Freedom from action's reactions is not obtained merely by abstaining from action, nor can perfection be achieved by renunciation alone. In fact, no one remains inactive for even a moment. Know for certain that everyone is forced to act, even unwillingly, by the qualities of material nature that hold sway over them. Verse 6. One who restrains the senses of action, but allows the mind to continuously dwell on the objects of sense attraction, deludes oneself and is called a charlatan. Verse 7. On the other hand, one who controls the senses by way of the mind and, relinquishing material attachments, engages the active senses in the yoga of action, is superior by far. Verse 8. Better than inaction is action in accordance with your prescribed duty. One cannot even maintain one's physical body without action. All right, so there are our verses for this evening. And now we'll come back and revisit verses 1 and 2 in detail. So Arjuna said, O Janardana, Krishna, if discernment and reason are higher than fruitive work, then why do you want me to engage in this horrific warfare? O Keshava, I'm confused by your bewildering instructions. Therefore, please tell me definitively what singular course of action I should take in order to achieve the greater good. So, Arjuna is seeing two things. And that's understandable because Krishna spoke in two sections in chapter 2, from verse 11 through 38. He describes the yoga of discernment, or put simply, that we are not these material bodies. We are eternal spirit souls having a temporary material experience. And all of our problems are rooted in this one problem, ignorance, avidya, the misidentification of the self as the not self, or mistaking oneself to be the mind and body, identifying with what are actually qualities of material nature that influence us to identify in a particular way. And that's not just a social construct or even a mental construct. It's a physical construct. Our bodies. We think, I am this body. I look in the mirror and this is what I look like. I put on these clothes and this is how I'm dressed. I stub my toe and it happened to me, not just my toe. I feel it. So this is the root cause of all of our problems. And it's the root cause of Arjuna's problem. And this is why Krishna begins here with this very basic principle of the distinction between consciousness, the person in the body, and the body, the vehicle made of matter that consciousness is riding in. Then, verse 39, Krishna pivots. He says, okay, I've explained the yoga of discernment to you. Now I'm going to explain to you about how one acts in such a way as to free oneself from this illusion and the reaction to actions. Arjuna is hearing a either or proposition as opposed to a both and proposition. And he just wants one thing to do. Just wants Krishna to say, here's what you ought to do. I personally am always very suspicious when someone responds to a situation and immediately says, you know what you ought to do? This is what you ought to do. You may know people like that who, no matter what your situation is, they know what you ought to do. If you know someone like that, raise your hand. I know someone like that. Yeah, we all pretty much know someone. I've been somebody like that. I think it's taken a fair amount of personal growth on my part to not be that guy who always knows what you ought to do. Anyway, Krishna is also not that guy. He doesn't just start out with, you know what you ought to do. And that's kind of what Arjuna is asking for, you know. He wants it simple. We all want it simple. The world's not simple. Life is not simple. It's complicated, and that's why it's confusing, and that's why Arjuna is confused, and that's why I'm confused. That's why everyone's confused, because it's not simple. What Arjuna needs to hear, and what Krishna is now about to speak more about is how there are these two paths, but they go together synergistically. They're not mutually exclusive. They are mutually reinforcing when one understands them properly. So now we move to Krishna's response. The beloved Lord said, "O sinless Arjuna, I have described the steady path through this world as twofold. For contemplatives, it is the yoga of knowledge. And for those who are active, it is the yoga of action." Okay, fair enough. Arjuna is thinking, I should be a contemplative. Sounds to me like you're telling me I should pursue the path of knowledge. How am I going to do that if I'm on the battlefield fighting? And now Krishna is going to help us understand how these two things go together. Because one could easily think that the path of knowledge is a path of renunciation of the world, that everyone should become a monk or a monkette and walk away from the world and just try to acquire transcendental knowledge. Not everyone is suited for that. And in fact, most people are not suited for that. So Krishna continues. Freedom from actions, reactions is not obtained merely by abstaining from action, nor can perfection be achieved by renunciation alone. If we cease to act, our karma does not just stop in its tracks. If we attempt to just stop engaging with the world, we've still got a whole trainload of karma from past actions coming our way, and it will find us. All of the reactions to our past actions will still find us, even if we decide we're just going to sit on the sidelines and contemplate the truth or knowledge or the distinction between matter and spirit. So we're still going to have to deal with that. We still have to respond. And inaction alone will not burn up that karma. How is one supposed to respond to the trainload of karma coming down the tracks in such a way so that one becomes freed from future karma? After all, whatever action we take in response to our karmic reactions logically results in yet another karmic reaction. Arjuna used the word fruitive action. So fruitive action is an interesting phrase to describe action that generates a reaction. You act and it's like planting a seed. And the fruit doesn't show up right away. The seed takes root, and then you get a shoot out of the ground, and then eventually it expands to have branches and leaves, and then fruit later. And that fruit may be very sweet or it may be very bitter, depending on the nature of the seed that we planted. So fruitive activity is activity that eventually bears fruit. So this catchy little phrase to describe actions that create future reactions is going to come up on a fairly regular basis, since karma is one of the principal subjects of the Bhagavad Gita. And in this particular section, we are speaking about karma yoga. Krishna continues. In fact, no one remains inactive for even a moment. know for certain that everyone is forced to act, even unwillingly, by the qualities of material nature that hold sway over them. So here, once again, the qualities of material nature, one of the other principal subjects of the Bhagavad Gita, makes an appearance as the material energy, or the energy that forces us to act in a particular way, which we have discussed. So the nature of how, or the way we will respond to our karma, is to some extent already determined by the qualities of material nature that we're influenced by. The range of our free will is actually a lot thinner than we like to believe that it is. And Krishna is giving us the means to expand the range of our free will. Under the influence of illusion, we don't even know that we're acting in accordance with the qualities of material nature that hold sway over us. We don't think there's anything holding sway over us. We think it's us. This is who I am. This is the kind of person that I am. And we think our actions are the actions of a free person. It's only when we step back through the agency of the yoga of discernment that we are able to see a distinction between ourselves and the qualities of material nature that influence, between other people and the qualities of material nature that are acting on them. And that knowledge is empowering, because now we can choose, we can be proactive about whether or not we continue to step back and observe the qualities of material nature that are influencing us, suggesting that we respond a particular way, or if we want to try to change the way we respond so that our actions are elevated above these qualities of material nature. That, in other words, we gain the power to make a decision to act in accordance with our spiritual nature or act in accordance with our material nature. Those are really our two choices. And every other choice we make is a subset of that primary choice, how we act. So does anybody have any questions about this aspect of our free will relative to the qualities of material nature and how we're obliged to act in particular ways? And it's the reasoning as to why inaction simply isn't enough, just won't cut it. Can't just sit on the sidelines, even if one's intention is to contemplate transcendental knowledge. Let me know if you have any questions about this portion of the program or any comments about this. While I'm waiting for, okay, we have a question. It's not so much a question as a comment. Deciding, yes, Rush, very wise band in some respects. Choosing not to decide is a decision. All right. While I wait for any other comments or questions, I'm going to come back to sharing my screen with you because I'm such a swell guy that I'm so generous. But before we proceed, all right, is the ultimate nature of the action and its karmic consequence, or the process of discernment, that matters more? And what if we discern wrong? Good question. Okay, so where Krishna is going with this is that he's going to take us up a ladder of motivation. In other words, the motivation for action is really what's going to matter here. And the motivation for action falls into one of these two categories, which is motivation based in material consciousness. As we've discussed, the concept of I and mine. It's all about me. I am the rightful enjoyer of the results of my actions. Material consciousness, blind to the influence of material nature that compels us to pursue a particular set of desires. Or spiritual consciousness, the conscious cultivation of an awareness of the self separate and apart from the qualities of material nature that influence us. Discernment really falls into that either or choice. And that's the basic discernment that Krishna proposes we make and that Arjuna makes in the first portion of his instructions. Now, we may, within the context of an action, make a mistake. Our senses are faulty. We are prone to not understand things as they are. We don't necessarily have a complete picture of everything. We may choose poorly. And that is consequential if the action is motivated by material consciousness and material desire. It is not as consequential if our motivation is based in spiritual consciousness and the desire to elevate consciousness above the qualities of material nature. If we make a mistake, well, we live with the mistake, and hopefully it does not have profoundly negative ramifications for others. But for ourselves, happiness and distress, two sides of the same coin. We do the best we can and try to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do from a position of spiritual consciousness and spiritual motivation. So I hope that answers the question, which again is the ultimate nature of the action and its karmic consequence, or the process of discernment that matters most? And what if we discern wrong? So I hope I've satisfactorily answered that question. If not, let me know. I'll try again. I may have discerned wrong. All right. Our next verse that we're looking at in detail, 3:6, is the verse that we are going to chant this evening. So you have it up on your screen, or you are listening very, very attentively if you are just listening to the audio portion of our program this evening. Here we go. I chant, you chant back. Karmendriyani samyamya ya aste manasa smaran indriyarthan vimudhatma Nityachara sa uchyate. So, for those of you who may be joining us for the first time, the bars over the vowels indicate a long open vowel sound. Dots over or under consonants mean some closure deeper in the mouth. C's, as in mityachara and uchyate, always indicate a CH sound, cha. If you want an S sound, we get an S. If you want a K sound, you get a K. So the C is used for the CH sound. And we pronounce each letter that's written. So an H after a consonant, like indriyarthan, you put some air behind the vowel that comes after it, as opposed to combining consonants So it would not be indriyarthan, the way we would do it in English, or mithya chara in the last line. It's mithya chara. Our translation: one who restrains the senses of action but allows the mind to continuously dwell on the objects of sense attraction deludes oneself and is called a charlatan or a yoga poser. Krishna is encouraging us to actually walk this talk. There is no shortage of yoga charlatans. And this goes back to India. It's not a modern Western phenomenon, but even within the yoga tradition, it's understood that people will sometimes practice yoga or make a show of yoga in order to impress people or gain some leverage over people or convince people to give them money or other things. And this is a real issue for us in our modern yoga community. There is no shortage of discussion about whether or not the idea of a guru in the yoga tradition has run its course. Has it become anachronistic? Because we find that we see someone who looks like they have made some advancement or had some insight, who's charismatic, who then takes advantage of people who are naive or trusting, etc. So this is also a situation that cannot endure. If we artificially restrain the senses of actions, which is to say we don't act in such a way as to pursue the fulfillment of material desires, but we think about them all the time. Externally, it looks like we're meditating. Om. Internally, what we're actually thinking about is whatever it is that floats our material boat. And so one never really develops the experience of yoga, because yoga is an internal experience. It's a subjective experiment that we do on ourselves. And so just the external appearance of yoga is superficial. It's not actually bringing us to the experience of yoga. In fact, eventually, but inevitably, one is going to lose control of the senses of action and once again be obliged to act in accordance with the qualities of material nature that hold sway over us. Let's go back to the second chapter, later in the second chapter, verses 62 and 63, where Krishna describes the sequence in which one falls into the illusion of material existence. When one's thoughts dwell on objects that attract the senses, attachment to those objects develop. And from attachment to such sense objects, the desire to satisfy the senses is born, and from that desire to satisfy the senses, anger arises. So the yogi who is externally repressing desires and controlling the senses artificially while still contemplating the objects of the senses is going to have a hard time maintaining that, because eventually the desire will want to express itself in action. And false renunciation, or renunciation beyond the level that one is actually authentically capable of maintaining will result in a hard heart, because that's how anger will manifest. You may still be controlling the senses by not indulging in the desires that one is thinking about all the time. But eventually, like a bump in a rug or a bad penny, it's going to show up somewhere. And that anger will manifest as hardness of heart. That frustration will become expressed as indifference to the suffering of others, rather than compassion for the suffering of others. Anger gives rise to bewilderment, and with bewilderment comes a loss of memory. When one's memory is lost, the power of discernment is lost with it. As the power of discernment recedes, the self vanishes from view. So, for the yogi who is not actually internally engaged in the process of yoga, then the whole activity is really a waste of time, and that's how they delude themselves. This is why Krishna describes such a pseudo-yogi as a fool. They're fooling themselves, and perhaps they are fooling others. But certainly, they're fooling themselves if they think that by the external practice of yoga, the appearance of yoga, but the internal contemplation of objects of material desire, that they're actually going to make any real substantive progress on the path of yoga. Okay, oh, we're not done yet. Back with me for a little while longer. All right, any questions about this aspect of pseudo-yoga by means of external performance as opposed to the actual inward turning of consciousness towards the self, engagement in authentic meditation? Please go ahead and pop any questions you may have into the Q&A box. Meanwhile, I am going to proceed to the next verse where Krishna gives the opposite scenario. On the other hand, one who controls the senses by way of the mind and relinquishing material attachments engages the active senses in the yoga of action is superior by far. So here, Krishna is putting the two things together. The process of turning inwards begins with controlling the senses. So you change your habits a little bit. You know, you don't just obey the demands of the tongue. You don't just instantly obey the demands of the eyes and the ears and the nose. You engage in some initial self-control. And by that initial exercise of self-control, the mind calms down. You could say that this is part of the concept of neuro-linguistic programming. So this is not a foreign idea for modern self-help gurus as opposed to ancient yoga gurus. The idea that you can affect your mind through your body. So for example, if you're feeling depressed and you have the body language of a depressed person, then you can make some progress in knocking yourself or bringing yourself out of that depressed state by changing your body language, by standing as if you were not depressed. You can fool the mind into thinking that you feel a certain way. Now, I'm not talking about clinical depression and things that have clear biological, physiological causes, and such like that. I'm talking about garden variety moods. You can change your mood by changing how you sit, how you stand, how you walk. And once that initial control of the mind is, or once the initial calming of the mind is achieved by reining in the senses, then it goes the other way. Then the intelligence directs the mind by virtue of transcendental knowledge, the knowledge of discernment, to focus on objects that facilitate the control of the senses, rather than focusing on objects that facilitate the derangement of the senses or the agitation of the senses. And this is how these two things go together. Because now, with the knowledge of the yoga of discernment, the intelligence directs the mind to direct the senses of action to act in such a way as to be informed by that transcendental knowledge. So your power of discernment, getting back to our previous question, comes into play when you choose not just how to act, but why. We take it a further step back, always start with why. It's really about a change in the motivation for action that may or may not change how you act. And in Arjuna's case, it won't. He's a warrior. How is he going to act? He's going to fight. That's how the qualities of material nature have made him. But the why is going to change, and that is going to make all the difference. Okay, next question. How do you know if yoga mega teachers are properly on the yogic path or actually interested in fame or fortune? Good question. At the end of the second chapter that we have just concluded, Arjuna asks Krishna, what are the symptoms of one who has acquired this power of discernment and is able to act on the basis of this power of discernment? How do they walk? How do they sit? How do they talk? So this requires that we have a frame of reference of transcendental knowledge ourselves in order to know what are the symptoms of a person who is walking that talk. And then you look at teachers in the yoga community, and by their behavior, you can see, are they acting with attachment to the results of their actions? Are they aspiring for something spiritual? Do they get frustrated when things don't go their way? How attached to, say, fame and fortune are they? You know, it's a little bit of a delicate balance, because on the one hand, my teachers told me that I should teach, and in order to teach, I have to have somebody to teach. Therefore, there must be acts of shameless self-promotion involved. And I have to make a living doing this because, well, frankly, I'm not good at anything else. And no one's going to hire me to do anything else. I have to just do this. So for me, it's process of elimination. What is my motivation? Well, I am motivated by the desire to have a reasonable amount of material comfort, because I'm not the kind of person whose mind will be peaceful in a situation of complete renunciation. On the other hand, I also don't aspire to be wealthy. I want to try to be exemplary about what it is I'm teaching. Otherwise, I am also a charlatan. I'm a pretender. So one who's equipoised in happiness and distress, who acts for the sake of serving others and the elevation of others, who is free from envy. I received a question recently about, what does the Bhagavad Gita have to say about envy? And it actually has quite a lot to say about envy. In fact, it is one of the principal themes in the Bhagavad Gita. It will show up a little bit later in this chapter. We're only perhaps 2 episodes away from the first appearance of a reference to envy. And therefore, I'm going to save what I have to say about that and how the Bhagavad Gita really emphasizes or focuses on this topic of envy for those episodes. For now, knowing that Arjuna's qualification for hearing from Krishna is the absence of envy. And that one whose actions are demonstrably free from envy is a sure sign of someone who is making progress on the path of spiritual life. Anyway, so head back to Arjuna's question towards the end of chapter 2 in the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna gives you a complete list of symptoms of one who is situated in transcendence, and then take that knowledge and use your own power of discernment to decide what a high-profile teacher is about, and whether their primary motivation is to become famous and make a lot of money, or if their primary motivation is to make progress along the path of spiritual life by helping others make progress along the path of spiritual life. Jess, did I answer your question in the course of not? Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay, here we go, home stretch. The last verse from this section, verse number 8. Better than inaction is action in accordance with your prescribed duty. One cannot even maintain one's physical body without action. So here, Krishna is giving Arjuna the one thing. Here's what you ought to do. Engage in your prescribed duty. However, do it from a position of transcendental knowledge. Do it with proper understanding. And as we will see in our next section coming up, you will act in such a way that you will not generate a future reaction. All right. Here we go. Oh, go back, go back. There we go. Tonight's program. Here's what we did tonight. We didn't do this. We did that last week. This happens sometimes. What we really did was we looked at Arjuna's confusion, what he was confused about, why he was confused, that he was seeing 2 totally separate things in terms of walking away from the world or engaging with the world, and not making a connection, that it's a both and rather than an either or thing. You put these 2 things together, the yoga of discernment and the yoga of action, and you get the right combination that will take you on the path transcendence rather than on the path of entanglement in the material world. We spoke about how to be a yoga poser and fool yourself along with fooling others. Our verses were 3:1 through 3:8. All right. If you have any questions after the fact, oh, here we go. Hold on. All right. So our question from Neela Madhava. What about teachers who have a veneer of being saintly but have something really bad in their background and they deny it? Now that's the key part of it, is whether or not you are actually willing to face your past if you've got one. And odds are you've got one. Saint Augustine, or Augustine, depending on, I don't know, what region of the country you're in, said that every sinner has a future and every saint a past. And if we are completely disqualified by a past that we regret, that we have a deeper understanding of now than we did then, and that we have hopefully rectified to some degree and are continuing to experience legitimate remorse about, then no one is ever going to hear from any teacher, because no one will be seen as qualified to teach. One of my teachers actually spoke about how the more advancement he made in his spiritual practice, the worse he felt, and he couldn't understand why for years. And it finally occurred to him that the reason he felt bad was because he was actually genuinely coming to terms with his past. And it was regrettable. And he was experiencing remorse. So in one sense, you can feel good about feeling bad, because as the muck floats to the surface so that we can scrape it off and purify ourselves, we can see just how much muck there is. Now, on the other hand, if someone is in denial about their past, and they become popular, then, you know, there are risks involved there. If you know that someone has a past and they simply are in denial about that, well, you may not want to hear from that person because they may not have made as much spiritual advancement as one might hope. You may want to feel compassion for that person because they're not getting over their past. Or you may want to find the good in what it is they are offering and accept that. The saying in Vedic devotional culture is that a swan can drink nectar even out of a dirty pool. They can separate the sweet nectar even from a polluted place. So we can try to be like that. So depending on the individual circumstance, you make the best choice as to how you want to respond to someone who either consciously denies or subconsciously is just in denial of a regrettable past. One last note on that. one has engaged in an abominable past, as long as they are genuinely trying to advance on the path of spiritual life, they should still be considered saintly. Now, that's someone who has given up whatever activity they have engaged in the past. And even if they stumble, as long as they're trying sincerely, as best they can, then you cannot find fault with such a person in the same way you can't find fault with someone who's dirty while they're taking a shower. There's no point in criticizing someone for being dirty if they're in the process of trying to clean themselves up. So that's my other thought on that. Everyone, I think, needs to make an individual determination based on their individual relationship to that person, their particular needs, how they understand that person's particular situation. So I hope that answers your question. And if there are more questions, please send them to me. I love to receive them, and I'm always very happy to correspond with you. Hari@Hari-kirtana.com. So please feel free to send your questions my way. Upcoming events, just so you know, in case you are out in Lawrence, Kansas, or thereabouts, I will be in Lawrence, Kansas, unlikely as that may sound to me, but I'm very happy that I've received an invitation from Gopi Sandal, Yogi Extraordinaire, to participate in her Yoga with Heart Yoga Teacher Training Program. That will be the weekend that spans across June 9th to 11th, so a long weekend. I'm really looking forward to being out there. There'll be sessions all weekend long, so please, if you are out there, I'm looking forward to seeing you. In a few weeks, on Thursday evenings, just before this webinar begins, I will be the guest of my good friend, Adam Ellenboss, on his webinar, the Nightlight Astrology webinar, from 6:30 to 7:30, close to our start time, 8 o'clock here. We'll be talking about astrology and the Bhagavad Gita, what the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita have to do with astrology. Now, I should point out, Adam is a Hellenistic astrologer, not a Vedic astrologer. So this will be particularly interesting and fun to see what the correlations are. He is also a devotional yoga practitioner, and so I'm sure he'll have a lot to say about this topic as well. And then coming up a little later this month in June, there will be an info session for my 300-hour yoga teacher training program. You can see that on my Facebook page and on my website. So if you are thinking about taking an advanced yoga teacher training program, and Jess, thank you very much for your very kind endorsement. Please come to the info session and find out what we're offering and meet our faculty. Next week, we are going to proceed to the art of sacrifice. We're going to speak about action without reaction. We're going to talk about primitive mythology, the myths of yoga, one of my sort of least favorite ways of putting it. Showstoppers. We're going to hit another of our famous showstoppers in the Bhagavad Gita, or at least a showstopper that may not stop you from reading it, but might give you pause about taking the Bhagavad Gita seriously. And we're going to talk about Star Wars, because the Han Solo movie is out, and I haven't seen it, and the review in the New Yorker was really, really funny. Anthony Lane, by the way, is one of my favorite writers. I don't know if he qualifies as an author, but the first thing I read in the New Yorker is his movie reviews, even if I don't care about the movie. Anyway, may the force be with you. and may it be with you when we look at Bhagavad Gita, chapter 3, verses 9 through 15, and I trust it'll all make sense to you then. All right, and we are out of time, so thank you very, very much for spending your time with me once again on this Thursday evening. We somehow or other invoked auspiciousness in that the thunder and lightning, very, very frightening, ceased, and we were not interrupted by Vincent Price laughing. Again, I hope that you will send me your questions. Thank you all very, very much for spending your evening with me, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon. End meeting for all.